Imagine a billionaire CEO, powerful and untouchable, living a life of luxury in China. But behind closed doors, he had a dark secret, a forbidden affair with a young Malaysian woman in Texas. He promised her the world, but what she didn't know was that someone was watching, someone who refused to be replaced. One night, their passionate romance took a terrifying turn, a mysterious warning, a shadow lurking in the dark. Then bang! A gunshot shattered the silence. When the police arrived, they found a horrifying scene. Blood on the floor, a body motionless and standing over it. A woman with eyes full of rage, but was this just a crime of passion? Or was something even more malicious at play? This is a chilling story of love, betrayal, and revenge, a deadly game where no one leaves unscathed. Who was the real victim? Who planned the perfect crime? And who paid the ultimate price? Stay with us till the very end as we unravel the shocking truth behind this tragic affair. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to Crime Chronicles and turn on notifications so you never miss a gripping crime story. We bring you the most shocking real-life cases from around the world, stories of deception, obsession, and murder that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Are you ready for the truth? Let's begin. Li Wei had everything a man could dream of: power, wealth, and influence that stretched from Beijing's towering skyscrapers to the bustling streets of New York. As the CEO of one of China's largest technology firms, he was respected, feared, and envied. His life was carefully curated, every move scrutinized by the media, his reputation flawless. At least that's how it appeared on the surface. But beneath the polished exterior, Li Wei harbored a secret, a hunger that his billions couldn't satisfy, a hunger for something different, something thrilling. That hunger led him to Mia Tan. We could call it a chance encounter, or fate. The night he met Mia was like any other business trip: dull meetings, endless handshakes, and a tiresome dinner with American investors. When it finally ended, Li dismissed his security detail and decided to take a quiet stroll through the city, something he rarely did. He wasn't just seeking fresh air, he was seeking escape. That's when he saw her. The dimly lit restaurant on the corner of the street was nearly empty, except for a young woman clearing tables. She wasn't just beautiful, she was effortlessly enchanting. Her long black hair cascaded down her back. Her skin glowed under the warm lights, and when she laughed softly at something one of her co-workers said, it sent a spark through him. For a moment, Li simply stood outside, watching. Then, as if fate had decided for him, he stepped inside. Mia greeted him with a polite smile, her almond-shaped eyes filled with curiosity. She had no idea who he was, no recognition, no fake charm, just simple kindness. "Table for one?" she asked. Her voice was soft, melodic. Li hesitated, then nodded. She led him to a secluded booth, her scent lingering in the air, jasmine and vanilla. He sat, observing her as she moved effortlessly between tables, joking with customers, her laughter light and unburdened. She was young, full of life, and completely unaware of the dangerous game she was about to be pulled into. Li returned the next night, and the night after that. At first, he told himself it was nothing, a passing attraction or a moment of weakness. But the more he saw Mia, the harder it became to stay away. She was unlike the women in his world. No pretenses, no greed in her eyes. She didn't care about power or money. She was drawn to him, not his wealth. Or so he thought. One evening after closing time, Li finally spoke to her beyond the casual pleasantries. "You work late," he observed, watching as she wiped down a table. Mia looked up, a playful smirk on her lips. "And you eat late." He chuckled, a rare, genuine laugh. "I suppose I do." For the first time in years, he felt something real. That night they talked for hours. Mia told him about her dreams of traveling the world, about growing up in Malaysia, and how she ended up in Dallas trying to build a life on her own. She was ambitious, independent, but still naive to the cruel nature of the world, especially the one Lee lived in. He didn't tell her the truth about himself, at least not at first. He wanted to exist in her world for just a little longer, where he wasn't a billionaire with enemies and obligations, but just a man. But secrets don't stay buried forever. As their meetings turned into secret dates, Lee found himself making promises he had no business making. "You should come to Paris with me," he whispered one evening, as they sat in a private booth at a high-end lounge, their hands intertwined under the table. Mia laughed, shaking her head. "Paris? I barely afford rent. You think I can just fly to France?" Lee leaned in, his voice smooth, tempting. "What if I make it happen? A week, no worries, no work, just you and me." Her smile faltered slightly. I don't know." He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the flicker of doubt. So he sweetened the offer. "Have you ever worn a diamond necklace worth $1 million?" he teased, brushing his fingers along her wrist. Mia bit her lip, blushing. That's ridiculous. But it wasn't, not in Lee's world. He could give her anything, anything she wanted, and for the first time she seemed tempted. That's when she asked, "Why me?" Lee paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because you remind me of something I lost a long time ago." Mia didn't press for details. Maybe she was afraid of the answer. But she should have been afraid of something else, someone else. Thousands of miles away, in a penthouse overlooking the skyline of Beijing, Ling Zhao sipped her tea and stared at the private investigator's report. She had known. She had known the moment Lee started traveling more frequently, answering her calls with less interest and avoiding her touch. Li Wei was a powerful man, but he was a fool if he thought he could outsmart his own wife. Ling was not a woman to be discarded. As she flipped through the photographs, Lee and Mia laughing together, holding hands, lips barely an inch apart, her grip tightened around the cup until it cracked. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply picked up her phone, dialed a number, and said 3 simple words. "Handle this, now." Back in Texas, Mia had no idea that her life was about to change forever. She was too busy falling in love with a man who could never truly be hers. Li Wei, lost in the thrill of their secret romance, was too distracted to notice the dark shadow creeping into his world. The eyes that followed them. The unknown number that called Mia one night, only for silence to greet her when she answered. The feeling of being watched. The game had begun, and in this game, someone was going to die. Mia believed every word Lee said. She dreamed of the life he painted for her. A life far away from her tiny one-room apartment with its flickering light bulb and leaky faucet. She pictured herself stepping into a world of grand hotels, shimmering jewelry, and expensive silk dresses. Lee made her feel special, like she was meant for more than just her boring routine job. And she trusted him. Every time he held her hand, whispered sweet promises, or kissed her forehead, her heart swelled with hope. But Mia didn't know that someone was watching. At first it seemed like nothing. Just a dark SUV parked near the cafe where she and Lee met every Thursday night. She barely noticed it the first time. But then, the same SUV appeared when she went shopping 2 days later, and again when she left work. It always stayed a little far away, never too close, but close enough to make her uneasy. One evening, as she stepped out of the cafe, she saw it again. The headlights were off, but the silhouette of someone inside was barely visible. She turned to Lee, her voice soft but laced with worry. "I think someone is following me." Lee glanced at the SUV and forced a smile. "It's just your imagination, sweetheart. You've been working too hard." He kissed her forehead and wrapped his arm around her, leading her away. But deep inside, fear crawled up his spine. He knew exactly who was behind this. Ling. His wife had found out. Mia tried to shake off the feeling, but her chest tightened every time she saw the vehicle. One night, while walking home, she felt it again. That eerie sensation of being watched. The streets were quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional honk of a distant car and the hum of streetlights buzzing above. She quickened her pace, her heels clicking against the pavement. Then she saw him. A man in black stood across the street, partially hidden behind a telephone pole. He wasn't moving. He was just staring. His dark eyes locked onto hers, cold and unblinking. Mia's breath caught in her throat. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She wanted to look away, to pretend she hadn't noticed him, but she couldn't. It was as if she were frozen in place. And then he took a step forward. Panic surged through her veins. She gripped her purse tighter and turned on her heel, nearly breaking into a run. The streetlights above flickered, casting eerie shadows on the sidewalk. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel his presence, like an invisible hand pressing against her back. She finally reached her apartment building, her fingers fumbling as she unlocked the door. She slammed it shut behind her, her breath coming in short gasps. Pressing her back against the wooden door, she squeezed her eyes shut. Was she imagining things? Or was this real? Her phone buzzed. It was Lee. "Sweetheart, are you home?" His voice was calm, but she could hear the slight shake in it. "Yes," she whispered, still trying to catch her breath. "Lee, I saw someone." Silence. Then a slow exhale. "Don't worry, baby. It's nothing." But even as he said it, his hands trembled. Because it wasn't nothing. He had been dreading this moment for weeks. Ling knew. Ling, the woman he had promised to be loyal to, the woman who controlled more power than he ever would, the woman who never ever let go of what was hers. And Mia had just become her target. The next day, Mia tried to convince herself it was all in her head. Maybe the man wasn't even looking at her. Maybe the SUV was just a coincidence. But the moment she stepped outside, the feeling of unease returned. That night she met Lee at their usual spot. The warm glow of the cafe lights made everything feel normal again. Lee reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Mia, you have to trust me. I will protect you." She wanted to believe him. But when they stepped out onto the street, the SUV was there, and standing beside it was the man in black. This time, he wasn't across the street. He was right in front of her. Mia gripped Lee's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. Lee's jaw tightened. He knew exactly who had sent him. Ling wasn't just watching anymore. She was making her move. The night was quiet, too quiet. Mia sat on her bed, scrolling through her phone when it vibrated with a message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. "Leave Li Wei or you will disappear." Her breath hitched and her hands trembled as she stared at the words glowing on her screen. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Who sent this? Was it a joke? Or was it real? She clutched her phone and ran out the door, barely remembering to grab her keys. The streets were dimly lit, and the cold air bit at her skin as she rushed to Lee's apartment. Her heart pounded with every step, her mind racing with terrible thoughts. When she arrived, she banged on the door, her pulse wild. Lee opened it, surprised to see her breathless and shaking. "Mia? What's wrong?" he asked, pulling her inside. She handed him her phone. "Read it," she whispered. Lee's eyes scanned the message, and for a moment, just a tiny moment, his expression darkened. But it was gone so fast Mia almost thought she imagined it. He let out a short laugh and tossed her phone onto the couch. "Sweetheart, it's nothing," he said, wrapping his arms around her. "Just jealous people trying to scare you." Mia pulled back, staring into his eyes. But what if it's serious? What if someone really wants to hurt me? Lee smiled and reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek new phone. Here, a new number, a fresh start. Block that message and forget about it. Mia hesitated, but took the phone. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was just a prank. Maybe she was overthinking. But deep down, something gnawed at her, a whisper of doubt she couldn't shake. The next morning, Mia woke up feeling uneasy. She tried to ignore it, pushing away the thoughts that haunted her all night. But when she stepped outside her apartment, a chilling sight made her blood run cold. A dead rat lay in front of her door. A knife was stabbed through its tiny body, pinning it to the ground. Mia's scream shattered the early morning silence. Her legs felt weak as she stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might burst. Who would do this? Was this a warning? Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone and dialed Lee. "Lee! Someone left a—" Her voice cracked, and she choked on her words. "Mia, calm down," Lee said quickly. "I'm coming. Don't open the door for anyone." Minutes felt like hours as she waited, curled up on the couch, staring at the locked door as if something would break through at any second. When a knock finally came, she jumped. "It's me," Lee's voice called. She rushed to open the door and threw herself into his arms. "Lee, it was horrible! A rat with a knife, it was right there!" She pointed outside. Lee's face darkened as he stepped past her, glancing down at the gruesome sight. His jaw clenched. He pulled the knife out and tossed the rat into a plastic bag, his movements stiff and controlled. "It's just a scare tactic," he said, but there was something in his voice, something not as confident as before. "Scare tactic? Lee, someone is threatening me. This isn't just a message anymore. It's real." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I don't feel safe. Maybe I should leave." Lee grabbed her shoulders. "No, Mia, don't run. That's what they want. If you leave now, they'll think they've won." Drop your thought in the comments. What would you do if you were in Mia's shoes? Would you disappear and never see Lee again? Would run away with him to a safer place? She swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" Lee hesitated. "I will handle it. Trust me." Mia wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that Lee could fix this, make everything okay. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she had never seen before. Fear. Lee was afraid. She had never seen him like this. Never seen him look over his shoulder or flinch at shadows. But now he was different. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he shoved the plastic bag into the trash. He wasn't as calm as he pretended to be. Mia's stomach twisted. She had no idea what Lee was up against, and worse, she had no idea if he could win. Lee had planned everything carefully. He didn't tell anyone, not even his closest friends. He wanted to take Mia somewhere safe, away from the eyes that watched them, away from the silent threats that followed her every move. He booked a private villa deep in the woods, far from the city where no one could find them. As they arrived, Mia felt a small sense of relief. The villa was beautiful, surrounded by towering trees and fresh, crisp air. Inside, a warm fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting soft golden light across the wooden walls. Lee held her hand and led her to the couch, his touch warm and reassuring. "We're safe here," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "No one will find us." Mia wanted to believe him. She curled up beside him, listening to the comforting crackle of the fire. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe, to imagine that maybe, just maybe, they had escaped the nightmare. Then, everything changed. The lights went out. The room was swallowed by darkness. The only light came from the dying embers of the fireplace, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Mia's body tensed. She clutched Lee's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Something's wrong," she whispered. Lee stood up, his muscles tight with tension. He pulled out his phone, but the screen was black, no service and no signal. A sound came from outside, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on gravel. Mia's breath hitched. Lee! A shadow moved past the window. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. The air turned cold, pressing against her skin like ice. The fire flickered, casting long, twisting shapes across the walls. Then, the front door exploded open. The force of it sent wood splinters flying into the air. Mia gasped and scrambled back, her heart slamming against her ribs. A masked figure stood in the doorway, dressed in black from head to toe. In his gloved hands he held a gun. Mia couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The world seemed to slow, her brain struggling to process what was happening. Lee stepped in front of her, his arms spreading out protectively. "Who are you? What do you want?" he demanded. The figure didn't answer. Then bang! The gunshot rang through the room, deafening and final. The flash of the muzzle lit up the dark for a split second, burning the moment into Mia's mind forever. Lee's body jerked backward. His eyes widened in shock, and a dark stain spread across his chest. Then he collapsed. "No!" Mia screamed, her voice breaking as she lunged toward him. Blood pooled beneath his body, staining the wooden floor, a deep, terrifying red. His lips moved, as if trying to say something, but no sound came out. Mia reached for him, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Lee! Lee! Stay with me! Please!" Tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision. You promised we'd be safe!" A shadow loomed over her. The masked figure was still there. Mia's body turned to ice. Slowly, she lifted her head, locking eyes with the cold, empty gaze behind the mask. The gun was still pointed at her. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. Every muscle in her body was frozen in fear. The masked figure took a slow step forward. Mia's breath hitched. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Her mind screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something, anything. Then, the figure raised the gun again. The last thing Mia saw was the glint of the barrel as the trigger was pulled. Mia's whole body shook as the masked figure loomed over her, the gun still aimed at her chest. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, the figure lifted a hand and pulled off the mask. Mia's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes widened in horror. It was Ling, Lee's wife. Ling's dark eyes burned with rage, her face twisted with fury. "Did you really think you could steal my husband and live happily ever after?" she spat, her voice dripping with venom. Mia's body went cold. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. "Please, I didn't mean to—" "Shut up," Ling snapped, stepping closer. Her grip on the gun tightened. "You ruined everything. You took what was mine. Now, you're going to pay." Mia's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. She backed up until her back hit the wall. There was nowhere left to go. Her eyes darted toward Lee's lifeless body, the pool of blood spreading across the floor. He had promised to protect her, but now he was gone. Ling lifted the gun, her finger pressing against the trigger. Mia shut her eyes. This was it. This was how it would end. Then, wailing sirens. The piercing sound of police sirens filled the air, growing louder by the second. Flashing red and blue lights spilled through the windows, painting the walls in bursts of color. Ling's head snapped toward the window. "No!" she hissed under her breath. Her hand trembled for the first time. She turned to run, but it was too late. Bang! The door burst open, and a flood of police officers stormed in. "Drop the weapon!" one of them shouted, their guns aimed directly at Ling. Ling's eyes darted around wildly, searching for an escape, but there was none. She took one step back, then another. The gun wavered in her grip. "I said drop it!" the officer barked again. With a frustrated scream, Ling spun around to run, but before she could take another step, two officers lunged at her. They tackled her to the ground, the impact shaking the entire room. The gun skidded across the floor, spinning out of her reach. Mia gasped as she watched Ling struggle, kicking and screaming, but the officers held her down. One of them twisted her arms behind her back while another snapped cold metal handcuffs around her wrists. "You'll regret this!" Ling shrieked. "You don't understand! That girl, she ruined everything!" Mia pressed herself against the wall, her body still frozen with fear. Her legs felt like jelly, and her head swam with dizziness. It was over, and it had to be over. One of the officers turned to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently. Mia tried to speak, but no words came out. Tears welled in her eyes. She glanced at Lee one last time, her heart shattering. Nothing would ever be the same again. Mia sat in the cold, gray-walled police station, her whole body trembling. The shock of everything that had happened weighed on her like a heavy chain. Li Wei was gone, dead. His blood still stained her hands. She stared at them, barely able to breathe. Across the room, Ling sat in handcuffs, her wrists red from struggling against them. She was screaming in Mandarin, her voice sharp and filled with rage. The officers ignored her, their faces blank as they finished paperwork. The fairy tale was over. It had never been real. It had always been a lie. A dangerous and deadly lie. A detective, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, sat down across from Mia. He placed a cup of water in front of her, but she didn't touch it. "You're lucky we got there in time," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Someone tipped us off." Mia's throat felt dry. She could barely form words. "Who?" The detective didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his file and pulled out a small piece of paper. He slid it across the table toward her. Mia's fingers shook as she picked it up. The paper was slightly crumpled, as if someone had folded and unfolded it many times. The words were written in Chinese characters. Her heart pounded. "What does it say?" she whispered. The detective leaned back. "It was found in Li Wei's hotel room. A worker saw it and handed it over, and we had it translated." Mia swallowed hard and turned the note over. Her eyes scanned the words, her breath catching in her throat as she read. "If something happens to me, my wife is behind it. Save Mia." A choked sob escaped her lips. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the note in her trembling hands. Lee had known. He had tried to protect her, even in his last moments. He had been thinking of her. She squeezed her eyes shut, her chest aching with sorrow. She had wanted so badly to escape with him, to start fresh, to be happy. But now, all that was left was emptiness. The detective cleared his throat. "You should go home and rest. You've been through a lot." Mia nodded slowly, though she knew she wouldn't sleep. How could she? An officer led her outside. The Texas night was cold and still. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. Everything looked the same, but she knew nothing would ever feel normal again. She pulled her coat tighter around her body, but it didn't help. She wasn't just cold on the outside, she felt frozen inside, numb and hollow. She had survived, but at what cost? As she took one last look at the police station behind her, she whispered, "Goodbye, Lee." Then, she walked into the night alone. If you were on the edge of your seat through this chilling tale, there's more where that came from. Like this video if you enjoyed the suspense. Comment your thoughts below. What would you have done in Mia's shoes? And subscribe to Crime Chronicles for more spine-tingling stories that will keep you hooked till the very last word. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Because sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones that could happen to you.